Welcome to this journey through the mundane magnificence of ancient Rome, where empires were built not through grand gestures alone, but through the accumulation of countless ordinary days, bureaucratic procedures, and institutional adjustments that slowly transformed the world. In the gentle rhythm of administrative routine and daily custom, you'll disk. In the pre-dawn darkness of ancient Rome, as the first pale light began to filter through the narrow windows of countless insulae and the spacious atriums of Patrician Domus, a city of over 1 million souls began its daily transformation from slumber to industry. This was not the dramatic awakening of epic poetry, but rather the gentle, methodical stirring of routine that had repeated itself for centuries. A rhythm as predictable as the rising sun that cast its first rays across the 7 hills. You might imagine the Roman morning as a time of grand proclamations and momentous decisions. But the reality was far more prosaic and, perhaps, more fascinating in its very ordinariness. The average Roman citizen, whether freedman or slave, patrician or plebeian, awoke not to trumpets or fanfare, but to the simple biological necessity of greeting another day. There were no alarm clocks in the modern sense, no mechanical devices to pierce the morning quiet. Instead, Romans relied on the gradual brightening of natural light and the stirring sounds of twice, only sounds of two neighbors beginning their own daily preparations. The first activity of any Roman day was the light morning meal. Though meal might be too generous, a term for what typically consisted of little more than bread, perhaps dipped in wine or water, sometimes accompanied by honey, cheese, or olives if the household could afford such luxuries. This was not the elaborate breakfast we might envision, but rather a practical fueling of the body for the work ahead. The bread itself was often several days old, as Romans baked infrequently and stored their loaves carefully. The wealthy might enjoy fresh bread from their own ovens, while the poor relied on the neighborhood bakery or, more commonly, on bread distributed as part of the grain dole. As the morning light strengthened, the sounds of the city began to swell. The clip-clop of mules and donkeys echoed through the streets as merchants began their deliveries. The voices of early shopkeepers calling out their wares drifted through windows. Water carriers made their rounds, their vessels clanking rhythmically, as they supplied the upper floors of insulae where running water was a luxury unknown. This was the symphony of Roman productivity beginning, complex orchestration of individual efforts that would, by noon, transform the quiet streets into bustling centers of commerce and industry. The Roman working day for most citizens lasted precisely 6 hours, beginning at dawn and ending at noon. This was not arbitrary, but deeply practical, reflecting both the limitations of natural light and the Mediterranean climate that made afternoon labor uncomfortable during much of the year. For those engaged in manual trades, the bakers, the fishmongers, the carpenters, the weavers, these 6 hours represented intense, focused activity. There was no leisurely beginning to the workday, no gradual increase in productivity. From the moment sufficient light permitted safe and accurate work, Romans applied themselves with the dedication of people who understood that their afternoon leisure was earned only through morning industry. Consider the daily routine of a typical Roman baker, one of the most essential figures in any neighborhood. His day began well before dawn, while most of the city still slept. By the light of oil lamps, he would examine the loaves that had been rising through the night, adjusting the temperature of his ovens with the practiced eye of generations of experience. The kneading of new dough, the shaping of loaves, the careful timing of baking cycles, all of this required precision and attention to detail that allowed no room for error. A poorly baked batch could mean financial loss in a world where margins were thin and competition fierce. The fishmonger faced different but equally demanding challenges. His day began at the docks, selecting from the catch that had been brought in during the night by boats that had ventured into the waters beyond the Tiber's mouth. The evaluation of freshness, the negotiation of prices, the arrangement of his wares for maximum appeal, all of this required expertise developed over years of practice. Throughout the morning, he would call out his offerings, engaging in the rapid-fire bargaining that characterized Roman commerce. By noon, whatever remained unsold would need to be disposed of, as the afternoon heat would quickly render fish inedible. For the wealthy Romans who owned these establishments or lived off the income from property and investments, the morning hours were occupied with different but equally routine activities. The paterfamilias of a substantial household might spend his morning hours receiving clients, reviewing accounts with his steward, dictating correspondence to his secretaries, or consulting with his legal advisors about contracts and property matters. These activities, while perhaps less physically demanding than manual labor, required no less attention and skill. The Roman matron, meanwhile, supervised the complex operation of her household. This involved far more than modern domestic management might suggest. She needed to coordinate the activities of potentially dozens of slaves, each with specific responsibilities and skills. The preparation of the day's meals required careful planning and supervision, as did the cleaning of the house, the maintenance of clothing and linens, and the education of children. The efficient management of a Roman household was a skill that required years to master and constant attention to maintain. As the morning progressed toward noon, the streets filled with the particular energy of a city at work. Slaves hurried between households carrying messages, market goods, and various necessities. Free citizens made their way to shops, workshops, and public spaces to conduct business. The sound of hammering echoed from metalworking shops, while the rhythmic thud of looms provided a steady background beat in neighborhoods where textile work was common. But perhaps most characteristic of Roman mornings was the daily shopping that occupied such a significant portion of many citizens' time. Unlike modern societies with their systems of refrigeration and preservation, Romans needed to purchase fresh food every single day. This was not simply a matter of preference, but of practical necessity. Meat spoiled quickly in the Mediterranean climate, vegetables wilted, and dairy products soured. The daily shopping expedition was therefore both a social activity and an essential household task. The Roman housewife or her designated slaves would make regular rounds of familiar vendors, establishing relationships that were crucial to securing the best quality goods at fair prices. They would examine each piece of meat carefully, testing its freshness with experienced hands. They would select vegetables with the discerning eye of people who understood that a poor choice could affect not just the day's meal, but the health of their families. The negotiation of prices was an art form in itself, requiring knowledge of market conditions, seasonal variations, and the personal circumstances of both buyer and seller. Yet as noon approached and the Roman working day drew to its close, might wonder what drove these people to maintain such disciplined schedules, such careful attention to routine, such dedication to the mundane details of daily existence. What held together this vast urban society, this complex web of relationships and responsibilities that somehow managed to function day after day, year after year, century after century, as the Roman sun reached its zenith and the morning 6 hours of labor drew to their predetermined close? The great city underwent a transformation as remarkable as it was routine. The workshops fell silent, the markets quieted, and the streets, which just moments before had buzzed with commercial activity, began to fill with a different kind of energy entirely. This was the beginning of the Roman afternoon, a time that belonged not to necessity but to leisure, not to survival, but to the cultivation of the social bonds and cultural practices that defined what it meant to be Roman. The transition from work to leisure was not gradual, but decisive, marked by the position of the sun and the agreement of generations that afternoon belonged to different pursuits entirely. This division of the day reflects something profound about Roman values and social organization. Unlike societies that viewed continuous labor as virtuous, Romans understood that leisure served essential functions in maintaining the complex social fabric of their civilization. The afternoon hours were when Romans became most fully themselves, when the roles and relationships that held their society together were reinforced and renewed. For many Romans, the afternoon began with the most important social activity of their day, the visit to the public baths. These were not simply places for washing, though cleanliness was certainly valued, but rather complex social institutions that served functions we might struggle to understand today. The bathhouse was simultaneously a place of physical maintenance, social networking, business discussion, political conversation, and cultural display. To comprehend the Roman afternoon, one must understand the central role these institutions played in daily life. The typical Roman citizen visited the baths once or twice per week, but this was not merely a matter of personal hygiene. The bathhouse experience was an elaborate ritual that could easily consume several hours and served multiple purposes simultaneously. Upon entering, the bather would proceed through a carefully designed sequence of rooms, each maintained at different temperatures and serving different functions. The appetiterium was where clothes were removed and stored, often under the watchful eye of a slave whose sole responsibility was preventing theft. The tepidarium provided a warm environment for gradual acclimation to heat. The caldarium was intensely hot, designed to promote sweating and open the pores. The frigidarium offered cold water for closing the pores and invigorating the body. But this physical progression through the baths was accompanied by an equally important social progression. The bathhouse was where Romans of different classes mingled in ways that would have been impossible in other settings. While social hierarchies were never forgotten, wealthier Romans might be attended by personal slaves who would carry their bathing equipment and massage oils. The shared experience of bathing created opportunities for conversation and relationship building that transcended normal social boundaries. Consider the experience of a middle-class Roman merchant visiting his local bathhouse on a typical afternoon. As he progressed through the various rooms, he might encounter a senator with whom he had business dealings, a fellow merchant who could provide information about market conditions, a client who owed him money, or a patron who might offer future opportunities. The conversations that took place in the relaxed atmosphere of the baths could be more frank and productive than those conducted in more formal settings. Business deals were negotiated, political opinions shared, friendships solidified, and social networks maintained. The bathhouse also served as a venue for physical exercise and games. Many baths included palaestrae exercise grounds, where Romans could engage in wrestling, ball games, and other physical activities. This was not casual recreation, but serious pursuit, as Romans valued physical fitness and competitive spirit. The games played in the baths were often quite sophisticated, requiring skill, strategy, and teamwork. They provided opportunities for Romans to demonstrate their physical capabilities and competitive drive while building relationships with their fellow citizens. For Roman women, the bathhouse experience was equally important, but necessarily different due to social conventions that required gender segregation. Women typically bathed at different hours than men, usually in the morning or early afternoon. Their bathing experience was no less social or important. However, the women's hours at the baths provided crucial opportunities for the maintenance of female social networks, the exchange of information about household management, child-rearing, and social events. These conversations were essential to the functioning of Roman society, as women were responsible for many aspects of domestic life that required coordination and cooperation between households. The Roman bath also served as a place where social hierarchies were both displayed and subtly negotiated. The quality of a person's bathing equipment, their strigils for scraping oil and dirt from the skin, their perfumed oils, their towels and robes communicated their social status as clearly as their clothing or housing. Wealthy Romans might arrive at the baths accompanied by several slaves carrying elaborate bathing accessories. While poorer citizens made do with simple equipment they carried themselves. Yet the shared experience of bathing created a common ground where these differences, while acknowledged, did not prevent social interaction. The afternoon hours were also when many Romans attended the various spectacles that played such an important role in Roman culture. The gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances that we often associate with Roman decadence were, in fact, carefully organized social institutions that served multiple functions. They provided entertainment, certainly, but they also reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated imperial generosity, celebrated religious festivals, and created shared experiences that helped bind the diverse population of the empire together. The seating arrangements at these events were strictly regulated according to social class. Senators sat closest to the action, followed by equestrians, then ordinary citizens, with slaves and foreigners relegated to the highest and most distant seats. This arrangement ensured that every person present was constantly reminded of their place in the social order, while simultaneously providing them with the satisfaction of being superior to those seated behind them. The spectacles thus served as both entertainment and social education, teaching Romans about hierarchy while providing them with the pleasure of belonging to the dominant civilization of their world. But for all the excitement of games and races, perhaps the most important afternoon activity for many Romans was simply the opportunity to socialize with friends and neighbors in a relaxed setting. Romans were intensely social people who valued conversation, friendship, and community connections. The afternoon hours provided time for the cultivation of these relationships, which were essential not only for personal happiness but for practical success in Roman society. The Roman concept of clientela, the system of mutual obligations between patrons and clients, required constant maintenance through social interaction. A wealthy Roman might spend his afternoons receiving visits from clients who came to pay their respects and seek advice or assistance. These relationships were not merely social pleasantries, but essential economic and political arrangements that provided security and opportunity for both parties. The patron gained prestige and political support, while the client received protection and access to resources that while we kiss, only ruby kiss, has the luxurious texture that glides on smoothly. It came raw like Siri. They came with us a loss of one tive. The Wally Kaylee Katie aside, my Katrin Katie. While we see, while we commit, we commend it, we see, we kate it. We command it eight, we lev, we see well me. It command, peleb. We bend to canat, we sigat, would otherwise be unavailable. Yet as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon and Romans prepared for their evening meal, one might wonder about the deeper purpose of these elaborate social rituals. What function did they serve in maintaining the stability and prosperity of one of history's greatest civilizations? How did the seemingly casual activities of bathing, gaming, and socializing contribute to the complex task of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates? As the Roman afternoon gradually yielded to evening, and shadows began to lengthen across the city streets and courtyards, the rhythm of daily life shifted once again toward the most significant social ritual of the Roman day, the main meal known as cena. This was not merely the consumption of food, but rather an elaborate ceremony that reinforced family relationships, social hierarchies, and cultural values that lay at the very heart of Roman civilization. The evening meal was where Romans most fully expressed their understanding of order, tradition, and the proper conduct of civilized life. The timing of cena was as carefully regulated as every other aspect of Roman daily routine. The meal typically began between the 8th and 9th hours after dawn, roughly 4 to 6 o'clock in modern terms, when the day's heat had begun to subside, but sufficient daylight remained for the proper appreciation of food and company. This timing reflected the Roman understanding that the evening meal should be a leisurely affair, unhurried by the pressures of work or the approaching darkness of night. It was a time when Romans could fully attend to the pleasures and responsibilities of domestic life. The preparation for cena began hours before the meal itself, involving the coordinated efforts of numerous household members. In wealthy households, slaves specialized in different aspects of meal preparation worked under the supervision of the household steward and the direct oversight of the mater-familias. The selection of ingredients, the preparation of multiple courses, the arrangement of the dining space, and the coordination of service all required careful planning and precise execution. This was not casual dining, but ceremonial eating, where every detail carried social and cultural significance. The Roman dining room, or triclinium, was arranged according to strict social conventions that governed not only where people sat, but how they reclined, what they wore, and how they conducted themselves throughout the meal. The traditional Roman arrangement called for 3 couches positioned around a central table, with the most honored position reserved for the paterfamilias or the most distinguished guest. Other family members and guests were seated according to their age, gender, and social status, creating a physical representation of the household's social order. The progression of courses during cena followed established patterns that had evolved. Over centuries of Roman dining culture, the meal typically began with gustaccio appetizers that might include eggs, olives, honey, wine mixed with honey, and various preserved foods designed to stimulate the appetite and establish the tone for the meal to come. These initial offerings were often artfully arranged and served on the household's finest vessels, demonstrating both the family's prosperity and their appreciation for aesthetic refinement. The main portion of the meal, known as prima mensa, featured the dishes that represented the household status and the cook's skill. For wealthy families, this might include elaborate preparations of meat, fish, and fowl, often prepared with imported spices and presented with considerable artistic flair. Poorer families would make do with simpler fare bread, cheese, vegetables, and perhaps a small amount of meat or fish. But even these modest meals were governed by the same social conventions and ceremonial expectations that characterized more elaborate dinners. The conversation during cena was as carefully structured as the food itself. Roman dining was an opportunity for the exchange of ideas, the discussion of public affairs, the sharing of news and gossip, and the reinforcement of family values and traditions. The paterfamilias typically guided these conversations, ensuring that they served educational and social purposes appropriate to the family status and the occasion. Children learned proper behavior by observing their elders, while guests were entertained and honored through skillful conversation and attentive hospitality. The role of women during cena reflected the complex nature of gender relations in Roman society. While early Roman custom had required women to sit rather than recline at meals, by the late Republic and early Empire, aristocratic women had gained the privilege of reclining alongside their husbands. This change represented a significant evolution in Roman social norms, reflecting the growing influence and status of upper-class women in Roman society. However, women were still expected to moderate their consumption of wine and spoo, to conduct themselves with appropriate dignity and reserve. The service of wine during cena was governed by elaborate rituals that demonstrated the Romans' sophisticated understanding of hospitality and social ceremony. Wine was typically mixed with water in proportions that varied according to the occasion, the season, and the preferences of the household. The mixing of wine was often performed ceremonially, with the proportions chosen to reflect the desired tone of the evening: stronger wine for celebration, weaker wine for everyday meals, and various intermediate mixtures for different social situations. The conclusion of the main meal led to secundae mensae, the serving of desserts, fruits, nuts, and additional wine that extended the social aspects of dining well into the evening. This portion of the meal was often the most relaxed and conversational, when business concerns gave way to entertainment, philosophical discussion, or simple family enjoyment. It was during secundae mensae that Romans might engage in games, listen to music, enjoy poetry, recitations, or simply savor the pleasure of good company and comfortable surroundings. For Roman children, Cena provided essential education in social behavior, family values, and cultural expectations. They learned to conduct themselves properly in social situations, to show appropriate respect for their elders, to engage in intelligent conversation, and to appreciate the customs and traditions that defined their family's place in Roman society. The evening meal was thus both immediate pleasure and long-term cultural transmission, ensuring that Roman values and practices would continue to shape future generations. The domestic slaves who served during Cena occupied a complex position within the household hierarchy. While their status as property placed them at the bottom of the social order, their intimate involvement in family life often created relationships of genuine affection and mutual dependence. Skilled slaves who could prepare elaborate meals, serve gracefully, or provide entertainment through music or conversation were highly valued and often treated with considerable consideration. The evening meal thus provided opportunities for slaves to demonstrate their abilities and potentially improve their circumstances within the household. The cleanup and preparation for the following day that followed Cena involved the coordinated efforts of the entire household. Dishes needed to be cleaned, leftover food properly stored, the dining area restored to order, and preparations begun for the next day's meals. This work continued well into the evening and required careful organization to ensure that nothing was wasted and everything was ready for the following day's routine, as Roman families finally retired for the night. Moving from the social spaces of their homes to the private quarters where they would sleep until dawn brought another day of carefully ordered routine. The day's activities had served purposes far beyond mere survival or pleasure. The elaborate structure of Roman daily life, from the disciplined morning hours of work, through the social activities of the afternoon to the ceremonial importance of the evening meal, created and maintained the social bonds, cultural values, and hierarchical relationships that enabled Roman civilization to function effectively across vast territories and diverse populations. The boring details of Roman daily routine were not merely individual choices or personal preferences, but collective social achievements that required constant attention and commitment from every member of society. The predictable rhythm of work and leisure, the careful observation of social conventions, the maintenance of household order, and the preservation of cultural traditions created the stable foundation upon which Rome's political and military achievements were built. Yet even as Romans settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of familiar routines and predictable satisfactions, larger forces were at work that would eventually challenge and transform the world they had created through centuries of careful attention to the mundane details of civilized life. How did the accumulated weight of individual daily routines contribute to the creation of institutions capable of governing an empire? What happens when the simple patterns of daily life must adapt to the complex demands of imperial administration? In the aftermath of decades of civil war that had torn the Roman Republic apart, as the dust settled from the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and the last remnants of republican opposition faded into history, a young man named Gaius Octavius, soon to be known as Augustus, faced a challenge that would have daunted even the most ambitious of his predecessors. He needed to create, from the scattered remains of republican institutions and the urgent demands of governing a vast empire, an administrative system capable of managing territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. What emerged from this challenge was not the dramatic transformation we might expect from epic narratives, but rather a careful, methodical process of bureaucratic innovation that would shape the daily lives of millions for centuries to come. The Genius of Augustus lay not in sweeping away the old republican institutions, but in quietly supplementing them with new offices and procedures that could handle the practical realities of imperial governance. While consuls and praetors continued to be elected with great ceremony and traditional fanfare, the real work of administration was increasingly performed by appointees who answered directly to the emperor. This dual system, maintaining the appearance of republican government while creating the reality of imperial bureaucracy, would prove to be one of the most successful political innovations in human history. Consider the seemingly mundane problem of ensuring that Rome's population of over 1 million people received adequate food supplies. Under the Republic, this had been handled through a combination of private commerce, temporary expedients during crises, and occasional distributions of grain by ambitious politicians seeking popular support. Augustus recognized that such ad hoc arrangements were insufficient for the stable governance of an imperial capital. He therefore created the office of Praefectus Unknown, the prefect of the grain supply, whose sole responsibility was the complex task of ensuring that adequate food reached Rome's markets every single day of the year. The Praefectus Unknown oversaw what was perhaps the most sophisticated logistics operation in the ancient world. Ships had to be built, maintained, and staffed for the journey from Egypt, where much of Rome's grain was produced, to the port of Ostia. Warehouses had to be constructed and managed for the storage of vast quantities of grain. Distribution systems had to be created to move food from storage facilities to retail outlets throughout the city. Quality control measures had to be implemented to prevent spoilage and fraud. Financial arrangements had to be maintained to pay for transportation, storage, and distribution. Personnel had to be recruited, trained, and supervised to handle every aspect of this operation. The complexity of this single administrative function illustrates the broader challenge Augustus faced in creating imperial government. Every aspect of urban life required similar systematic attention. The maintenance of public buildings led to the creation of the office of Praefectus Fabrum, the prefect of public works, who oversaw the construction, repair, and maintenance of temples, forums, basilicas, theaters, and other public structures. The need for clean water supplies led to the appointment of curators aquarum, supervisors of aqueducts, who managed the complex engineering systems that brought fresh water to the city from distant mountain sources. The maintenance of public order required the creation of entirely new institutions. Augustus established the Praefectus Urbanus, the urban prefect who commanded a police force responsible for maintaining peace in the city streets. He created the Praefectus Vigilum, the prefect of the vigils, who supervised fire brigades and night watchmen responsible for preventing and fighting fires in a city, where most buildings were constructed of wood and other flammable materials. He instituted the Praetoriae cohorts, the Praetorian Guard, who served not only as imperial bodyguards, but as a reserve police force, capable of handling major disturbances. Each of these new offices required not just a single administrator, but entire staffs of subordinate officials, clerks, accountants, inspectors, and various specialists. The Praefectus Unknown, for example, needed harbor masters to oversee shipping, warehouse supervisors to manage storage, quality inspectors to examine grain shipments, accountants to track expenses and revenues, and distribution managers to coordinate retail sales. Each of these subordinate positions required specific skills and knowledge, creating demand for a new class of professional administrators who made their careers in imperial service. The recruitment and training of these administrators presented challenges that no previous government had faced on such a scale. Augustus and his successors developed sophisticated systems for identifying promising candidates, providing them with appropriate education and experience, and advancing them through increasingly responsible positions. The cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of republican magistries, was supplemented by parallel career paths in imperial administration that offered talented individuals opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth, or wealth alone. The equestrian order, the class of wealthy Romans below senatorial rank, became particularly important in imperial administration. These men typically had business experience and practical skills that made them well-suited for administrative responsibilities. Augustus and his successors regularly appointed equestrians to key positions in the imperial bureaucracy, creating a new avenue for social advancement while ensuring that essential government functions were performed by competent professionals. The development of imperial bureaucracy also required new approaches to record-keeping and communication. The administration of an empire required the maintenance of vast archives of laws, regulations, contracts, tax records, census data, military reports, and diplomatic correspondence. The tabularium, the central archive building in Rome, became one of the most important and closely guarded facilities in the empire, housing the documentary foundation upon which imperial government depended. The creation of the cursus publicus. The imperial postal system provided the communication infrastructure that made centralized administration possible. This system of relay stations, fresh horses, and professional messengers enabled emperors and their administrators to maintain regular contact with officials throughout the empire. Orders could be transmitted from Rome to distant provinces within weeks rather than months. Reports from frontier commanders could reach the capital quickly enough to influence policy decisions. The cursus publicus was thus not merely a convenience, but an essential tool of imperial governance that made possible the coordination of activities across vast distances. The financial administration of the empire required equally sophisticated innovations. Augustus separated imperial finances from the traditional republican treasury, creating the fiscus, the imperial treasury managed directly by his appointees. This new financial system enabled more systematic taxation, more efficient expenditure, and more careful accounting than had been possible under republican institutions. The collection of taxes throughout the empire was standardized and professionalized, replacing the often corrupt and inefficient tax farming systems of the Republic with direct imperial administration. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Augustus's administrative innovations was their gradual, almost imperceptible implementation. Rather than announcing sweeping reforms that might have alarmed supporters of republican traditions, Augustus introduced new offices and procedures as temporary expedients to address immediate problems. The praefectus unknown was presented as a necessary response to food shortages. The urban prefect was justified by the need to maintain public order. The reorganization of imperial finances was explained as more efficient management of public resources. Over time, these temporary expedients became permanent institutions, and Romans gradually became accustomed to the presence of imperial administrators in every aspect of public life. The transformation from republican to imperial government occurred so gradually that most Romans probably never realized they were witnessing one of the most significant political changes in human history. They simply noticed that public services were more reliable, that food supplies were more secure, that public order was better maintained, and that government functions were performed more efficiently than they remembered from earlier times. But, as effective as Augustus's administrative innovations proved to be, they also created new challenges and dependencies that would shape the future development of the empire. The imperial bureaucracy, once established, developed its own interests, its own culture, and its own momentum that would not always align with the broader interests of the empire or its people. How would future emperors manage and control the administrative machine that Augustus had created? What happens when bureaucratic procedures designed for one set of circumstances must adapt to changing conditions and new challenges? As the Roman Empire matured through the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the bureaucratic innovations initiated by Augustus evolved into a vast administrative machine that touched virtually every aspect of life throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. What had begun as emergency expedients to address immediate problems had become routine procedures performed daily by thousands of officials, clerks, accountants, inspectors, and various specialists whose mundane activities kept the imperial system functioning smoothly. To understand how the Roman Empire actually worked, one must examine not the dramatic decisions of emperors and generals, but the boring, repetitive, essential work of the imperial bureaucracy. Consider the daily routine of a clerk working in the office of the Praefectus Unknown during the reign of Trajan. When the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent and the administrative challenges of feeding Rome had become correspondingly complex. This clerk, let us call him Marcus Scribonius, was one of dozens of administrative assistants responsible for maintaining the records that made possible the continuous flow of grain from Egypt, North Africa, and other productive regions to the warehouses and markets of the imperial capital. Marcus's day began before dawn, not because of any particular drama or urgency, but because the volume of documentation required to maintain Rome's food supply demanded long hours and careful attention to detail. He would arrive at his office, located in one of the government buildings near the Forum, carrying with him the writing materials that were the tools of his trade, styluses for writing on wax tablets, reed pens for use with papyrus, ink made from soot and gum, rulers for drawing straight lines, and various measuring devices for calculating weights, volumes, and distances. The first task of each day involved reviewing the shipping reports that had arrived from Ostia and other ports. During the night, each arriving vessel had to be documented with information about its cargo, its point of origin, the identity of its captain and crew, the condition of its load, and any problems encountered during the voyage. This information had to be recorded in multiple copies, with one set of records sent to the Praefectus Unknown himself, another to the imperial treasury for financial accounting, and a third retained in the office files for future reference. The accuracy of these records was not merely a matter of bureaucratic tidiness, but of vital importance to the functioning of the empire. If a shipment of grain was recorded incorrectly, it might be distributed to the wrong markets, leading to shortages in some areas and waste in others. If the quality of a cargo was misrepresented, spoiled grain might reach Roman tables, potentially causing illness or unrest. If the financial accounts were inaccurate, the imperial treasury might overpay shippers or underpay suppliers, creating economic distortions that could affect the entire supply system. Marcus and his colleagues therefore developed elaborate procedures for cross-checking their work and ensuring accuracy. Each record was typically prepared by one clerk, reviewed by a second, and approved by a supervisor before being entered into the permanent files. Discrepancies had to be investigated and resolved before any action could be taken based on the documentation. This system of multiple reviews and approvals made the process slower, but much more reliable than it would have been otherwise. The maintenance of these records required not only accuracy, but also organization that would allow information to be retrieved quickly when needed. The office of the Praefectus Unknown maintained separate files for different types of information, shipping schedules organized by port and destination, cargo inventories organized by type and quality of grain, financial accounts organized by supplier and payment terms, and personnel records organized by the various categories of workers involved in the grain supply system. The physical management of these records presented challenges that modern administrators accustomed to electronic storage and retrieval systems might struggle to appreciate. Everything had to be written by hand on papyrus or parchment, materials that were both expensive and fragile. Documents had to be stored in ways that would protect them from moisture, insects, fire, and other threats, while still allowing authorized personnel to access them quickly when needed. The tabularium, the central archive building, employed hundreds of workers whose sole responsibility was the filing, maintenance, and retrieval of official documents. The copying of documents was another essential but time-consuming aspect of imperial administration. Every important record had to be duplicated multiple times to ensure that copies would survive if originals were lost or damaged. This copying had to be done entirely by hand, requiring scribes who could write quickly and accurately in the various scripts and languages used throughout the empire. A single lengthy report might require days of copying work by multiple scribes, and any error in transcription could have serious consequences for the decisions based on the copied documents. The coordination of activities across the vast Roman Empire required constant correspondence between officials in Rome and their counterparts in distant provinces. The prefectus unknown regularly exchanged letters with grain suppliers in Egypt, shipping agents in various ports, warehouse supervisors in provincial cities, and local officials responsible for ensuring that adequate supplies reached frontier garrisons. Each of these letters had to be carefully composed, accurately copied, properly addressed, and safely delivered through the cursus publicus postal system. The composition of official correspondence required considerable skill and knowledge of proper bureaucratic procedures. Letters had to follow established formats that made clear the authority under which they were written, the specific requests or instructions being communicated, and the actions expected from recipients. They had to be written in language that was precise enough to prevent misunderstanding, but diplomatic enough to maintain good relations with officials, whose cooperation was essential to the functioning of the system. The financial aspects of imperial administration created additional layers of bureaucratic complexity. Every transaction had to be documented, approved, and recorded in multiple account books. The purchase of grain required contracts specifying quantities, qualities, prices, delivery schedules, and payment terms. The transportation of grain required arrangements with shipping companies, including provisions for insurance against loss or damage during voyaging. The storage of grain required rental agreements for warehouse space, employment contracts for workers, and purchasing agreements for equipment and supplies. The imperial treasury maintained separate accounts for different categories of expenditure, and the transfer of funds between accounts required elaborate documentation and approval procedures. The prefectus unknown could not simply spend money as needed, but had to submit detailed budgets for approval, provide regular reports on expenditures, and justify any deviations from approved spending plans. This financial oversight was designed to prevent corruption and ensure that imperial resources were used efficiently. But it also created additional administrative work that required time and attention from numerous officials. The personnel management aspects of imperial administration were equally complex and demanding. The grain supply operation employed thousands of workers in various capacities: sailors and ship captains for transportation, warehouse workers for storage and handling, inspectors for quality control, accountants for financial management, and various supervisors and administrators for coordination and oversight. Each of these employees had to be recruited, trained, supervised, evaluated, promoted, disciplined, and eventually replaced when they retired, died, or moved to other positions. The recruitment of qualified personnel required maintaining networks of contacts throughout the empire who could identify promising candidates for various positions. The training of new employees required developing curricula and procedures that would prepare them for their specific responsibilities. The supervision of ongoing work required regular inspections, performance evaluations, and corrective actions when problems were identified. The maintenance of employee records required documentation of hiring dates, salary levels, performance evaluations, disciplinary actions, and various other personnel matters. Yet for all its complexity and apparent efficiency, the imperial bureaucracy that Marcus Scribonius and thousands of his colleagues maintained daily was not without its problems and limitations. The very procedures designed to ensure accuracy and prevent corruption also made the system slow and inflexible. The multiple layers of review and approval that prevented errors also delayed decisions that might be urgently needed. The elaborate documentation requirements that enabled effective oversight also consumed enormous amounts of time and resources that might have been used more productively elsewhere. As Marcus concluded, another day of careful record-keeping and meticulous correspondence. Filing away the last of the day's shipping reports and preparing his desk for tomorrow's identical routine. He might have wondered about the larger purpose and ultimate sustainability of the system he served so faithfully. How long could such an elaborate administrative machine continue to function effectively? What would happen if the steady flow of resources and information that kept the system running was interrupted by war, natural disaster, or economic crisis? As the Roman Empire entered its 3rd century of existence, the bureaucratic machinery that had enabled such remarkable territorial expansion and cultural integration had grown into something far more complex and demanding than Augustus could ever have imagined. What had begun as practical solutions to immediate administrative challenges had evolved into an enormous, self-perpetuating system that consumed increasingly large portions of the empire's human and financial resources, while becoming ever more difficult to manage effectively. The daily routines of imperial administration, once efficient responses to governing needs, had accumulated into a bureaucratic burden that would ultimately contribute to the empire's most serious internal challenges. The expansion of the bureaucracy under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine represented both the culmination of Roman administrative development and the beginning of its most serious problems. By the 4th century, imperial government employed hundreds of thousands of officials, clerks, inspectors, tax collectors, and various specialists whose salaries, benefits, and administrative expenses consumed an enormous portion of imperial revenues. The Notitia Dignitatum, a late imperial document that catalogued all civil and military offices, reveals a hierarchical structure of such complexity that modern scholars still struggle to understand how it functioned in practice. Consider the daily challenges faced by a provincial tax collector during the reign of Diocletian, when the imperial government's financial needs had reached unprecedented levels due to military expenses, bureaucratic costs, and elaborate court ceremonies. This official, whom we might call Gaius Publicanus, was responsible for collecting various taxes from a district that might include dozens of towns and hundreds of rural properties. His work required not only the assessment and collection of quascu, and collection of quascu, a quascu color of quascu saro, and leaves a rich wascu salas, long-lasting color. From my lesting quas. From the liver of my lestig sesh, with my lestig, my lasset is it quas. It's quascu / qua, my falla quai, it's quas, sis, my sassment sive, pequide, with my se, with the light of it, kit, with I, but a sequides it, bebotted it, kit sits it made, kit I sets it, gets to sias it sick it, cause I we lit, sit to bit to bit it the suit lissy clots that sit it listen sec, sit to kit to be to picanis taxes, but also the maintenance of detailed records, the coordination of activities with other officials, and the transmission of revenues to higher authorities. The tax system by this period had become incredibly complex, involving multiple types of levies collected according to different schedules and procedures. The tributum soli was a tax on agricultural land based on its assessed productivity. The tributum capitis was a poll tax levied on individuals according to their status and occupation. The centesima rerum venalium was a sales tax collected on commercial transactions. The vicesima hereditatium was an inheritance tax paid when property was transferred between generations. The aurum coronarium was a special levy collected to celebrate imperial victories or other agies. You know, why are Chavis taxes required? Different administrative procedures imposed different challenges for collection. The land tax required regular surveys to assess property values and agricultural productivity. Work that might take months to complete and required specialized knowledge of farming, surveying, and property law. The poll tax required maintaining accurate census records of all residents in the district, including information about their occupations, family status, and ability to pay. The sales tax required monitoring commercial activities and ensuring that merchants complied with reporting requirements. The inheritance tax required investigating property transfers and determining appropriate tax liabilities. The assessment of taxes required Gaius Publicanus to make countless individual judgments about property values, personal circumstances, and tax liabilities. A farmer might claim that his land was less productive than official records indicated due to weather damage, pest infestation, or soil exhaustion. A merchant might argue that his business had declined due to increased competition or disrupted trade routes. A family might petition for reduced taxes due to illness, military service, or other hardships. Each of these claims had to be investigated, evaluated, and either accepted or rejected based on available evidence. The collection of taxes involved even more complex challenges. Many taxpayers lacked the cash needed to pay their assessments and had to be allowed to pay in kind with agricultural products, manufactured goods, or services. These payments in kind had to be evaluated, stored, transported, and converted into the money or supplies needed by the imperial government. A payment of grain had to be inspected for quality, measured accurately, stored safely, and eventually shipped to where it was needed. A payment of textiles had to be examined for defects, counted carefully, and distributed to military units or other government agencies. The record-keeping requirements for tax collection had grown exponentially over the centuries. Gaius Publicanus had to maintain separate accounts for each type of tax, each category of taxpayer, and each method of payment. He had to prepare regular reports for his supervisors showing collections, arrears, exemptions, and special circumstances. He had to maintain correspondence with taxpayers about their obligations, with other officials about coordination issues, and with superior authorities about policy questions. The sheer volume of documentation required for tax administration consumed enormous amounts of time and resources that could have been used for more productive purposes. The coordination required between different levels of government had also become increasingly burdensome. Gaius Publicanus had to work with local city councils, regional governors, provincial procurators, and various imperial officials in Rome. Each of these authorities had different responsibilities, different priorities, and different procedures for handling administrative matters. Decisions that might seem simple in principle often required weeks or months of consultation and negotiation between various offices before they could be implemented. The transportation of collected revenues to where they were needed presented additional logistical challenges. Tax payments collected in one province might be needed for military expenses in a completely different region. The movement of large quantities of money, grain, or other valuable goods required armed escorts, secure storage facilities, and reliable transportation networks. The cursus publicus postal system, already strained by the volume of official correspondence, was further burdened by the need to transport tax revenues and coordinate the activities of tax collectors across the empire. The human costs of this elaborate administrative system were enormous. The empire required not only the services of officials like Gaius Publicanus, but also the clerks, accountants, guards, messengers, and laborers needed to support their work. These personnel had to be recruited, trained, supervised, and compensated, creating additional administrative burdens and financial expenses. The most capable individuals in the empire were increasingly drawn into government service, leaving fewer talented people available for productive activities in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. The financial burden of maintaining such An extensive bureaucracy had become a significant drain on imperial resources. The salaries and benefits paid to government employees, the costs of maintaining office buildings and record archives, the expenses of the postal system and transportation networks, and the various other costs of administration consumed an ever larger portion of tax revenues. This created a vicious cycle where higher taxes were needed to pay for the bureaucracy that collected taxes, leading to increased economic pressure on the population and growing resistance to imperial authority. The complexity of the administrative system also made it increasingly prone to corruption and inefficiency. The multiple layers of review and approval that were designed to prevent errors and ensure accountability also created opportunities for officials to demand bribes for prompt service or favorable decisions. The elaborate procedures required for routine transactions made it easy for unscrupulous officials to delay or complicate matters for personal advantage. The sheer number of people involved in any significant decision made it difficult to assign responsibility when things went wrong. The provincial populations who ultimately bore the cost of this administrative complexity found themselves subject to an ever-increasing burden of taxes, fees, regulations, and bureaucratic requirements. Local elites who had once eagerly sought positions in city councils and provincial administration began to avoid these responsibilities because they had become more burdensome than rewarding. The curial class, the wealthy citizens who traditionally managed local government, gradually disappeared as families sought to escape the financial obligations that came with public service. As Gaius Publicanus concluded another exhausting day of tax assessment, record-keeping, and correspondence, submitting his reports to higher authorities and preparing for tomorrow's identical routine. The sustainability of the system he served was increasingly in question. The administrative machinery that had once been the empire's greatest strength was becoming a burden that sapped its energy and resources. The bureaucratic procedures that had once enabled efficient governance were becoming obstacles to effective decision-making. The complex hierarchy of officials that had once coordinated activities across vast territories was becoming a source of delay, expense, and popular resentment. How had a system designed to solve problems become a problem itself? What happens when the administrative costs of governing an empire begin to exceed the benefits that effective government can provide? And how do the accumulated burdens of bureaucratic complexity affect the daily lives of ordinary citizens who must somehow bear the ultimate cost of imperial administration? In the crisis-ridden 3rd century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire faced seemingly insurmountable challenges from barbarian invasions, military usurpers, economic collapse, and administrative breakdown. A career soldier from the Dalmatian provinces, named Diocletian, ascended to imperial power with a vision of restoration that would fundamentally transform the nature of Roman government. His solution to the empire's mounting problems was not military conquest or political rhetoric, but rather the systematic expansion and reorganization of imperial bureaucracy on a scale that dwarfed even Augustus's administrative innovations. What emerged from Diocletian's reforms was a governmental apparatus of unprecedented size and complexity, one that would succeed in stabilizing the empire, but at the cost of creating new burdens and dependencies that would ultimately contribute to its transformation into something entirely different from the classical Roman state. The magnitude of Diocletian's bureaucratic expansion can be measured in simple but staggering numbers. He increased the size of the imperial civil service from approximately 15,000 officials to over 30,000, effectively doubling the administrative apparatus of the Roman state within a single generation. This expansion was not arbitrary, but reflected Diocletian's systematic analysis of the empire's administrative failures and his determination to create governmental machinery capable of managing an empire under severe stress. Every aspect of imperial administration was reorganized, expanded, and subjected to new layers of oversight and control. The reorganization began with the fundamental structure of imperial government itself. Diocletian divided the empire into 4 prefectures, each overseen by a praetorian prefect who served as the emperor's chief administrative deputy. These prefectures were further subdivided into dioceses, each governed by a vicarius who coordinated the activities of provincial governors within his jurisdiction. The provinces themselves were reduced in size and increased in number, creating smaller, more manageable administrative units that could be supervised more effectively by centrally appointed officials. This new hierarchy created multiple layers of administrative oversight that required constant communication, coordination, and documentation. A routine administrative decision that might previously have been made by a single provincial governor now required consultation between the governor, the vicarius of his diocese, the praetorian prefect of his prefecture, and potentially the emperor himself or his closest advisors. Every level of this hierarchy required its own staff of assistants, clerks, accountants, and specialists. Multiplying the number of officials involved in even routine governmental functions. Consider the daily work environment of a clerk serving in the office of a diocesan vicarius during the early 4th century. Perhaps in the Diocese of Oriens, which encompassed much of what we now call the Middle East. This clerk, whom we might call Aurelius Bureaucraticus, was one of dozens of administrative assistants responsible for coordinating communications between the vicarius and the provincial governors under his jurisdiction, maintaining records of administrative decisions and policy implementations, and ensuring that imperial directives were properly transmitted and executed throughout the diocese. Aurelius's daily routine began with the sorting and prioritization of correspondence that had arrived from various sources during the night, reports from provincial governors about local conditions and problems, directives from the praetorian prefect about policy changes or administrative procedures, inquiries from imperial officials in other dioceses about coordination issues, petitions from local communities seeking administrative decisions or relief from various burdens, and routine reports from various subordinate officials about the ongoing work of government. Each piece of correspondence required careful analysis to determine its importance, its implications for diocesan administration, and the appropriate response. A report about barbarian raids on a frontier province required immediate attention and might need to be forwarded to military commanders and imperial officials responsible for defense policy. A petition from a city seeking permission to hold a festival required consultation with legal experts about proper procedures and financial officials about budgetary implications. A routine administrative report about tax collections needed to be filed properly and incorporated into statistical summaries that would be transmitted to higher authorities. The maintenance of accurate records had become increasingly critical as the administrative system grew more complex. Aurelius and his colleagues maintained separate files for different categories of information: correspondence organized by sender, and subject matter, administrative decisions organized by type and date, statistical reports organized by province and time period, personnel records organized by rank and responsibility, and various other specialized collections designed to enable quick retrieval of information when needed. 4. Administrative decisions. The physical demands of maintaining these records had grown proportionally with the expansion of the bureaucracy. The diocesan offices required enormous amounts of papyrus, parchment, ink, and other writing materials. They needed extensive storage facilities for active files and archives for older documents that might still be needed for reference. They required scribes capable of working in multiple languages and scripts, as the eastern provinces of the empire used Greek as well as Latin for official business, and many local communities conducted affairs in their traditional languages. The coordination of activities across multiple provinces within a single diocese required constant attention to scheduling, logistics, and communication. A policy decision made by the vicarius had to be transmitted to all relevant provincial governors, implemented according to uniform procedures, and monitored to ensure compliance and effectiveness. This process might involve dozens of officials at various levels of the hierarchy and require weeks or months to complete. The potential for misunderstanding, delay, or partial implementation was enormous, requiring additional layers of oversight and verification to ensure that imperial policies were actually carried out as intended. The financial administration of the diocese presented particularly complex challenges. The new tax system introduced by Diocletian involved multiple types of assessments collected according to different schedules and procedures. The tributum, based on land assessments, required regular surveys and evaluations. The capitatio, based on population counts, required accurate census data. Various indirect taxes required monitoring of commercial activities. Special levies for military equipment, public works, or imperial ceremonies required additional assessments and collections. Each type of tax required different administrative procedures and posed different challenges for assessment and collection. The coordination of tax policy across multiple provinces required ensuring that assessment methods were uniform, that collection procedures were fair and efficient, and that revenues were transmitted promptly to where they were needed. The diocesan vicarius had to balance the fiscal needs of the imperial government against the economic capacity of the local population, a task that required detailed knowledge of local conditions and careful political judgment. The expansion of the bureaucracy also created new opportunities for career advancement, but also new sources of competition and conflict within the administrative hierarchy. Aurelius and his colleagues were part of a growing class of professional administrators who made their entire careers in imperial service. These officials developed their own culture, their own interests, and their own perspectives that did not always align with the broader needs of the empire or the welfare of its citizens. The elaborate hierarchy of offices created by Diocletian provided clear paths for promotion and advancement. But it also created intense competition for prestigious positions and generated conflicts between officials at different levels of the system. A provincial governor might resent the oversight of the diocesan vicarius, while the vicarius might chafe under the supervision of the praetorian prefect. These conflicts could interfere with effective administration and create delays or distortions. In the implementation of imperial policies, the new administrative system also required new methods of training and education for officials. The complex procedures and elaborate hierarchy demanded specialized knowledge and skills that could not be acquired through traditional education or casual experience. Diocletian's government developed training programs, procedural manuals, and apprenticeship systems designed to prepare officials for their specialized responsibilities. This professionalization of imperial administration created a more competent and reliable civil service. But it also created a separate administrative class with interests distinct from both the imperial court and the general population. The cultural impact of bureaucratic expansion extended far beyond the government offices themselves. The presence of thousands of additional officials throughout the empire changed the relationship between the imperial government and local communities. Citizens who had previously dealt with government only occasionally now found themselves subject to regular interaction with various officials responsible for taxation, regulation, and oversight. The expansion of government created new opportunities for employment and advancement. But it also created new burdens and restrictions that affected every aspect of daily life. As Aurelius concluded another day of correspondence, record-keeping, and administrative coordination, filing away the last reports and preparing for tomorrow's similar routine. The long-term implications of Diocletian's bureaucratic revolution were only beginning to become apparent. The immediate goal of creating more effective imperial administration had been achieved, but at the cost of creating a governmental apparatus that was increasingly expensive to maintain, difficult to control, and burdensome to the population. It was supposed to serve. How would future emperors manage this vast administrative machine? What would happen when the economic resources needed to support such an elaborate bureaucracy began to diminish? And how would the provincial populations respond to the ever-increasing presence of imperial officials in their daily lives? As Diocletian's administrative reforms settled into routine practice during the early decades of the 4th century, the daily reality of governing the Roman Empire had been transformed in ways that affected every level of society, from the imperial court to the humblest provincial village. The elaborate new hierarchy of officials, the complex procedures for administrative oversight, and the expanded scope of governmental regulation created a system that was simultaneously more centralized and more burdensome than anything the Roman world had previously experienced. The provincial administration that emerged from these reforms represented both the pinnacle of Roman bureaucratic achievement and the beginning of administrative problems that would plague the empire for centuries to come. The daily experience of provincial administration under the new system can best be understood through the routine activities of local officials who found themselves caught between the demands of imperial oversight and the practical realities of governing diverse populations with limited resources. Consider the situation of a city councillor in a modest provincial town, perhaps in the Diocese of Gaul, during the reign of Constantine. This official, whom we might call Marcus Curialis, was a member of the local curial class, the wealthy citizens who traditionally provided leadership for municipal government, but who now found himself subject to administrative burdens and financial obligations that made public service more of a penalty than an honor. Marcus's day began with the review of correspondence from various levels of the imperial hierarchy. The provincial governor regularly transmitted directives about tax collection, public works projects, military supplies, and various administrative matters that required local implementation. The diocesan vicarius periodically issued policy statements and procedural requirements that had to be incorporated into municipal administration. Imperial officials responsible for specific functions: tax collection, military recruitment, public works. Religious affairs sent their own instructions and requests for information. The volume of official correspondence had increased dramatically under the new system, requiring Marcus and his colleagues to spend significant portions of their time simply reading, understanding, and responding to governmental communications. The implementation of imperial policies at the local level required constant coordination between municipal officials and their counterparts in other communities. A directive about military recruitment might require consultation with neighboring cities about quotas and procedures. A public works project might need cooperation from multiple municipalities to provide labor and materials. A tax assessment policy might require uniform implementation across an entire province to prevent economic distortions or popular unrest. These coordination efforts required additional correspondence, meetings, and negotiations that consumed time and resources that might otherwise have been devoted to local needs and priorities. The new tax system introduced by Diocletian created particularly heavy administrative burdens for local officials. The assessment of the tributum required detailed surveys of agricultural land, including measurements of area, evaluations of soil quality, assessments of productivity, and determinations of appropriate tax rates. This work required specialized knowledge of farming, surveying, and property law that many municipal officials did not possess. They had to either acquire these skills themselves or hire experts to assist them, creating additional expenses for communities that were already struggling with increased tax burdens. The assessment of the capitatio required maintaining accurate census records of all residents within municipal boundaries. This involved not only counting people, but also determining their occupations, family status, age, health, and ability to contribute to imperial revenues. The process required door-to-door surveys, detailed questioning of residents, verification of information, and regular updates to account for births, deaths, marriages, and other changes in family circumstances. The maintenance of these records required literacy skills, organizational ability, and attention to detail that placed significant demands on local administrative capacity. The collection of taxes presented even greater challenges than their assessment. Many taxpayers lacked the cash needed to pay their obligations and had to be allowed to pay in kind with agricultural products, manufactured goods, or services. These payments in kind had to be evaluated for quality and quantity, stored safely, until they could be used or transported and converted into the specific items needed by imperial officials. A payment of grain had to be inspected for spoilage, weighed accurately, stored in secure facilities, and eventually shipped to military units or government warehouses. A payment of textiles had to be examined for defects, counted carefully, and distributed according to imperial specifications. The transportation of collected revenues to higher authorities required additional logistical arrangements. Communities had to provide armed escorts for valuable shipments, arrange for secure storage during transport, and coordinate delivery schedules with imperial officials responsible for receiving tax payments. These arrangements required negotiation with transport companies, hiring of guards, and communication with officials at multiple levels of the administrative hierarchy. The costs of transporting tax payments sometimes consumed significant portions of the revenues being transmitted, creating additional financial burdens for local communities. The maintenance of public works and municipal services under the new administrative system required constant oversight and reporting to imperial authorities. Projects that had previously been managed entirely by local officials now required approval from provincial governors, consultation with diocesan authorities, and compliance with imperial regulations about construction methods, materials, and labor practices. A simple repair to a local aqueduct might require months of correspondence and bureaucratic approval before work could begin, during which time the problem might worsen and become more expensive to address. The recruitment of soldiers for imperial service placed additional burdens on local communities. Each municipality was assigned quotas for military recruits based on population and economic capacity. Local officials had to identify suitable candidates, verify their fitness for military service, arrange for their transportation to recruitment centers, and provide them with basic equipment and supplies. This process required maintaining records of eligible men, conducting physical examinations, negotiating with families about military service, and coordinating with imperial officials responsible for training and deployment. The religious policies of the imperial government created new administrative responsibilities for local officials. The Christianization of the empire under Constantine required communities to adapt their traditional religious practices to conform with imperial policy. Local officials had to oversee the conversion of pagan temples to Christian use, supervise the appointment of Christian clergy, ensure compliance with Christian moral standards, and mediate conflicts between different religious communities. These responsibilities required knowledge of Christian doctrine and law that many local officials did not possess, and sensitivity to religious tensions that could threaten public order. The judicial responsibilities of local officials had also become more complex under the new administrative system. Provincial communities were required to provide first-level adjudication for many types of legal disputes, with appeals directed to provincial governors and higher imperial authorities. Local judges had to understand not only traditional Roman law but also the various imperial edicts and administrative regulations that had been issued under the new system. They had to coordinate their decisions with higher authorities and maintain detailed records of legal proceedings for review by imperial officials. The financial management of municipal government required increasingly sophisticated accounting and reporting procedures. Local communities had to maintain separate accounts for different categories of revenue and expenditure, prepare regular reports for imperial authorities, and comply with audit procedures designed to prevent corruption and ensure efficient use of resources. These requirements demanded literacy and numerical skills that were not universally available among local officials and created additional administrative expenses that strained municipal budgets. The personnel management challenges faced by local officials had grown proportionally with the expansion of governmental responsibilities. Communities needed larger staffs of clerks, accountants, inspectors, guards, and various specialists to handle their increased administrative burdens. These employees had to be recruited from local populations, trained in specialized procedures, supervised in their daily work, and compensated from municipal resources. The competition for qualified personnel had intensified as the imperial government expanded its own recruitment of administrative staff, driving up salary costs and making it difficult for local communities to retain capable employees. As Marcus Curialis concluded another exhausting day of correspondence, meetings, and administrative coordination, preparing reports from multiple levels of imperial authority, and organizing tomorrow's schedule of equally demanding responsibilities. The sustainability of the new administrative system was increasingly questionable. The efficiency gains achieved through centralization and oversight were being offset by the administrative costs and delays created by bureaucratic complexity. The stability provided by expanded governmental control was creating new sources of tension and resentment among populations who found themselves subject to ever-increasing official supervision and regulation. How long could local communities continue to bear the administrative and financial burdens imposed by the expanded imperial bureaucracy? What would happen when the most capable and wealthy citizens began to withdraw from public service to avoid these burdens? And how would the imperial government respond when its elaborate administrative machinery began to break down due to the very complexity that was supposed to ensure its effectiveness? By the 5th century of the Common Era, the administrative system that Diocletian had created to save the Roman Empire was consuming resources and energy on a scale that threatened the very survival of the civilization it was meant to preserve. The elaborate hierarchy of officials, the complex procedures for governmental oversight, and the expanded scope of imperial regulation had created a bureaucratic apparatus so expensive and burdensome that many provincial communities found compliance with imperial administration more costly than the benefits of imperial protection. What had begun as administrative reform had evolved into administrative crisis, contributing to the fragmentation and eventual collapse of effective imperial government in much of Western Europe. The breakdown of Roman administration was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather a gradual process of institutional failure that played out differently in various parts of the empire over several centuries. To understand how this collapse occurred, we must examine the daily struggles of local officials who found themselves unable to meet the competing demands of imperial bureaucracy, barbarian threats, economic decline, and popular resistance. Consider the situation of a provincial governor in 5th century Gaul, perhaps governing a province that included territories now part of France, facing challenges that would have been unimaginable to his predecessors in earlier centuries. This governor, whom we might call Flavius Administratus, began each day not with routine correspondence and bureaucratic planning, but with crisis management on multiple fronts simultaneously. Reports arrived regularly about barbarian raids that disrupted tax collection, destroyed public works, and created refugee populations that required emergency assistance. Messages came from diocesan and imperial authorities demanding compliance with administrative procedures and tax quotas that were becoming increasingly impossible to fulfill. Petitions poured in from local communities seeking relief from various burdens, protection from military threats, and solutions to problems that the provincial government lacked the resources to address effectively. The tax system that had been the foundation of imperial administration was breaking down under the combined pressure of economic decline, population displacement, and military disruption. Agricultural communities that had provided the bulk of imperial revenues found their crops destroyed by warfare, their populations scattered by military raids, and their infrastructure damaged beyond their capacity to repair. Urban centers that had served as commercial and administrative hubs were contracting as trade routes became unsafe and economic activity declined. The wealthy citizens who had traditionally served in local government were emigrating to safer regions, converting their assets to portable form, or simply abandoning their civic responsibilities to focus on personal survival. Flavius Administrates found himself caught between imperial authorities who continued to demand traditional levels of tax revenue and local communities that lacked the economic capacity to provide them. The elaborate assessment and collection procedures developed under Diocletian assumed stable populations, functioning agricultural systems, and reliable transportation networks, conditions that no longer existed in many parts of the empire. When a community reported that it could not meet its tax obligations due to barbarian raids, the provincial governor had to choose between forwarding reduced revenues to higher authorities and facing potential discipline for administrative failure, or attempting to extract additional resources from communities that were already at the limits of their capacity. The military responsibilities of provincial government had also become unmanageable under the new conditions. Imperial authorities continued to demand that provinces provide recruits for the imperial army, but the young men who would have served as soldiers were increasingly needed for local defense against barbarian raids. Communities that provided soldiers to imperial forces often found themselves less capable of protecting their own territories, creating a vicious cycle where military service for the empire weakened local defenses and made communities more vulnerable to the very threats that imperial forces were supposed to prevent. The maintenance of public works and governmental infrastructure required resources and stability that were no longer available in many regions. Aqueducts damaged by warfare could not be repaired. When engineering expertise was unavailable and communities lacked the resources to pay for materials and labor, roads that had been essential for administration and commerce fell into disrepair. When local authorities could not afford maintenance and imperial resources were needed for more urgent military expenses, public buildings that had housed governmental offices and served as symbols of imperial authority were abandoned when officials fled to safer locations and communities could not afford their upkeep. The communication systems that had made centralized administration possible were breaking down as travel became dangerous and expensive. The cursus publicus postal system required secure roads, reliable way stations, and adequate funding to maintain horses and equipment. As roads became unsafe due to barbarian activity and local communities could no longer afford to support postal stations, the transmission of official correspondence became slow, unreliable, and expensive. Provincial governors might wait weeks or months for responses to urgent inquiries, while imperial authorities operated with outdated information about conditions in distant provinces. The personnel problems facing provincial administration had reached crisis proportions by the 5th century. The expansion of bureaucracy under Diocletian had created demand for thousands of qualified officials, but the deteriorating conditions in many provinces made governmental service increasingly unattractive. Capable administrators could find better opportunities in private service, military careers, or ecclesiastical positions that offered greater security and better prospects for advancement. The provincial government was left with less qualified personnel who lacked the skills and experience needed to handle complex administrative challenges. The financial administration of provincial government had become virtually impossible under these conditions. The imperial treasury continued to demand that provinces cover their own administrative expenses while transmitting specified revenues to central authorities. But many communities lacked the economic resources to support both local government and imperial obligations. Provincial governors found themselves managing budgets that were perpetually in deficit, with expenses that could not be reduced and revenues that could not be increased. The borrowing and financial manipulation that had temporarily addressed these problems in earlier periods were no longer viable as credit became unavailable and economic conditions continued to deteriorate. The judicial functions of provincial government were similarly compromised by the breakdown of imperial authority. Legal disputes that had previously been resolved through established procedures now required solutions that took into account the absence of effective central authority and the presence of competing sources of power. Provincial governors found themselves mediating between Roman law, barbarian customs, Christian doctrine, and local traditions in communities where multiple legal systems operated simultaneously and sometimes conflicted with one another. The relationship between provincial authorities and local communities had been fundamentally altered by the breakdown of imperial administration. Communities that could no longer rely on imperial protection increasingly made their own arrangements for defense, often involving agreements with barbarian groups or local strongmen, who could provide security that imperial forces could not guarantee. These arrangements sometimes conflicted with imperial policy and created divided loyalties that made effective provincial administration even more difficult. As Flavius Administratus reviewed, another day's accumulation of insoluble problems. Tax shortfalls that could not be remedied, infrastructure needs that could not be met, military threats that could not be addressed, and administrative demands that could not be fulfilled. The fundamental contradiction of late imperial administration had become clear. The system designed to strengthen imperial government had become so complex and expensive that it consumed more resources than it produced, creating administrative burdens that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened imperial authority. The collapse of Roman administration in the western provinces was not the result of external conquest alone, but also of internal administrative failure. The bureaucratic machinery created to govern the empire had grown beyond the capacity of the empire to support it, creating a situation where effective government became impossible and alternative arrangements became preferable to imperial rule. Local communities that could no longer benefit from imperial administration began to develop new forms of organization and governance that would eventually replace Roman institutions entirely. Yet, even as the Western Empire fragmented into successor kingdoms and local arrangements, the eastern provinces continued to maintain versions of Roman administration that would persist for another 1,000 years. What made the difference between administrative collapse and administrative continuity? How did some parts of the empire manage to preserve effective government while others descended into chaos and fragmentation? And what lessons might be drawn from the Roman experience about the relationship between bureaucratic complexity and governmental effectiveness? In the centuries following the expulsion of the last king and the establishment of the Roman Republic around 509 BCE, the Romans developed a complex system of government that was neither democracy in the Greek sense nor monarchy in the traditional sense, but rather something entirely new in human political experience, a mixed constitution that balanced different sources of authority through carefully designed institutions and procedures. Understanding how this republican system actually functioned in daily practice requires examining not the dramatic moments of crisis and war that fill historical narratives, but rather the routine operations of government that shape the lives of citizens and determine the policies of the state year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The foundation of republican government lay in the principle of collegiality, the idea that executive power should never be concentrated in the hands of a single individual, but should always be shared between at least two officials who could check each other's actions and prevent the emergence of tyranny. This principle was embodied most clearly in the consulship, the highest regular magistracy of the Roman state, which was always held by two men elected simultaneously for terms of exactly 1 year. The consuls possessed supreme executive authority, imperium within the boundaries of Roman territory, but their power was limited both by its temporary nature and by the presence of a colleague with equal authority, who could block any action through the exercise of veto power. The daily routine of republican government centered around the complex interactions between these various magistrates, each with specific responsibilities and limited terms of office. Consider the typical day of a consul during the Middle Republic. Perhaps in the 3rd century BCE, when Roman power was expanding throughout the Mediterranean, but the republican institutions were still functioning according to their original design. This consul, whom we might call Marcus Republicanus, began each day with the ceremonial procedures that marked his office and reminded both himself and the wrongry citizens of Rome of the sacred nature of governmental authority. Marcus Republicanus was preceded wherever he went by 12 lictors, ceremonial attendants who carried the fasces, bundles of rods bound around an axe that symbolized the consul's authority to punish and execute. These lictors were not merely decorative, but served important practical functions. They cleared the way for the consul in crowded streets, announced his presence to citizens who were expected to show appropriate respect, and provided a visible reminder of the power and dignity of republican office. The daily procession of the consul and his lictors through the streets of Rome was thus both practical transportation and political theater, reinforcing the authority of the state while making that authority visible and accessible to ordinary citizens. The consul's morning hours were typically devoted to judicial activities. As one of the primary responsibilities of the consulship was the administration of justice. Roman citizens had the right to appeal serious criminal cases to the consul, and the consul was responsible for ensuring that legal procedures were followed correctly and that justice was administered fairly. This work required not only legal knowledge but also political judgment, as the consul's decisions in prominent cases could affect his reputation and his future political prospects. The consul had to balance the demands of law, the expectations of citizens, the interests of the state, and the complex political relationships that shaped Roman society. The afternoon hours were often devoted to meetings of the Senate, the council of former magistrates that served as the advisory body for the consuls and other officials. The Senate had no formal legislative power under the Republican Constitution, but its influence was enormous because it consisted of men who had held high office and possessed the experience and knowledge necessary for effective governance. Senate meetings were conducted according to elaborate procedures designed to ensure orderly discussion and allow all members to express their views. But these procedures also made decision-making slow and sometimes inefficient. The consul, who presided over Senate meetings, had considerable influence over their proceedings, as he determined the agenda, recognized speakers, and summarized the sense of the discussion for the official record. However, he could not simply impose his will on the Senate, as the senators were his political peers and many of them had held the consulship themselves. The consul had to build consensus through persuasion, negotiation, and compromise skills that were essential for effective leadership in the republican system, but that required considerable time and effort too. Develop an exercise that the evening hours might be devoted to meetings with various citizens who sought the consul's attention for personal or public matters. The Roman system of clientela created networks of mutual obligation between powerful families and their dependents, and a consul was expected to be accessible to his clients and to provide them with advice, assistance, and protection when needed. These meetings were not merely social occasions, but essential political activities that maintained the relationships necessary for effective governance and future electoral success. The consul also had to coordinate his activities with his colleague, the other consul elected for the same year. This coordination was sometimes cooperative and sometimes competitive, depending on the personalities involved and the political circumstances of the moment. The two consuls might divide responsibilities geographically, with one remaining in Rome to handle domestic affairs, while the other led military campaigns in distant territories. They might alternate responsibilities on a monthly basis, with each taking primary responsibility for different aspects of government during his month of precedence. They might work together on major policy decisions while maintaining separate spheres of influence in routine matters. The relationship between the consuls and other magistrates created additional layers of complexity in republican government. The praetors, typically 2 or more officials elected annually, were responsible for judicial administration and served as deputies to the consuls when needed. The quaestors managed financial affairs and served as assistants to higher magistrates. The aediles supervised public works, markets, and festivals. The tribunes of the plebs represented the interests of the common citizens and possessed the power to veto actions by other magistrates. Each of these offices had its own responsibilities, its own traditions, and its own political significance. The coordination required between all these officials was achieved not through formal hierarchy, but through tradition, negotiation, and mutual respect. A consul could not simply order a praetor to take specific action, but had to request his cooperation and convince him that the proposed action was appropriate and necessary. A tribune could block actions by any other magistrate, including the consuls, but the exercise of this power had to be justified in terms of protecting the rights and interests of the plebs. The system worked because the officials involved understood their roles and accepted the legitimacy of the constitutional arrangements that defined their authority. The popular assemblies provided another essential component of republican government, though their role was different from that of modern democratic institutions. The comitia centuriata, organized according to military units, elected the higher magistrates and voted on declarations of war and peace. The comitia tributa, organized according to territorial tribes, elected lower magistrates and voted on most legislation. The concilium plebis, limited to plebeian citizens, elected the tribunes and passed plebiscites that had the force of law. These assemblies met according to established schedules and procedures, but their meetings were not open forums for debate, but rather formal occasions for voting on proposals made by magistrates. The daily operation of these assemblies required extensive preparation and coordination. The magistrate who summoned an assembly had to provide proper notice, ensure that the meeting place was prepared, verify that the auspices were favorable, and present the matter for consideration in appropriate legal form. The citizens who attended had to understand the issues involved and the implications of their votes, but they had no opportunity to debate or modify the proposals presented to them. They could only vote yes or no on the specific question posed. By the presiding magistrate, the religious aspects of republican government were integrated into every aspect of daily governmental routine. All important public actions required favorable auspices determined by official priests who interpreted signs from the gods. Meetings of the Senate or popular assemblies could be postponed or canceled if the auspices were unfavorable. Military campaigns could not begin without proper religious ceremonies. Judicial proceedings required appropriate ritual observances. This integration of religion and government was not mere superstition, but a fundamental aspect of Roman political culture that provided legitimacy for governmental authority and connected political actions to the broader cosmic order. As Marcus Republicanus concluded another day of ceremonial duties, judicial proceedings, Senate meetings, and citizen consultations. Retiring to his private quarters to prepare for tomorrow's similar routine, the Republican system he served embodied principles and practices that had evolved over centuries of political experience. The complex interactions between magistrates, Senate, and popular assemblies created a system of government that was capable of making binding decisions for the Roman state while preventing the concentration of power in any single institution or individual. But this system, effective as it had proven in governing a city-state and its immediate territories, was beginning to face challenges that would test its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. How would Republican institutions respond to the pressures created by territorial expansion, military obligations, and the administration of distant provinces? What happens when traditional procedures designed for local governance must be applied to imperial responsibilities? as Roman military success expanded the Republic's territories far beyond the Italian peninsula, encompassing vast provinces from Spain to Syria and from Britain to North Africa. The governmental institutions designed for managing a city-state and its immediate neighbors found themselves confronting administrative challenges of unprecedented scale and complexity. The traditional magistracies, with their annual terms and collegial structure, the Senate with its advisory role and collective wisdom, and the popular assemblies with their territorial organization and direct voting procedures, all struggled to adapt to the realities of governing an empire while maintaining the fundamental principles and practices that had made the Republic successful in the first place. The most immediate pressure on Republican institutions came from the sheer geographical scope of Roman responsibilities. The traditional system assumed that magistrates would exercise their authority within or near the city of Rome, where they could consult with the Senate, communicate with their colleagues, and remain accessible to citizens. But military campaigns and provincial administration required officials to spend months or years in distant territories, far from the institutional support and oversight that had traditionally constrained and guided their actions. This geographical dispersal created practical problems that forced significant modifications to traditional procedures and eventually undermined some of the basic principles of Republican government. Consider the situation faced by a consul in the 2nd century BCE who was assigned to conduct a military campaign in Spain, a province that required several months of travel to reach from Rome and where campaigning seasons might extend far beyond the one-year term that limited consular authority. This consul, whom we might call Gaius Imperialis, found himself caught between the constitutional requirement that his imperium would expire on a specific date and the practical necessity of completing military operations that could not be concluded within the traditional time frame. The solution developed by the Romans was the creation of promagistries, extensions of imperium that allowed former consuls and praetors to continue exercising authority in provincial commands after their regular terms of office had expired. A consul whose military operations in Spain could not be completed within his year of office would have his imperium extended by the Senate, allowing him to continue as proconsul until his mission was accomplished or a replacement could be appointed and dispatched. This innovation preserved the fiction of annual magistracies while creating the reality of extended commands that gave individual officials far greater power and independence than had been possible under the original Republican system. The daily routine of a proconsul governing a distant province was fundamentally different from that of magistrates operating within the traditional Republican framework. Gaius Imperialis, exercising proconsular authority in Spain, could not consult with the Senate about daily administrative decisions, could not coordinate his actions with colleagues in Rome, and could not be directly supervised by other magistrates or popular assemblies. He was effectively an independent ruler, constrained primarily by his understanding of Roman law and policy, his concern for his future political career, and his awareness that he would eventually have to account for his actions when he returned to Rome. The administrative responsibilities of provincial command required skills and knowledge that were not developed through the traditional cursus honorum that prepared Romans for domestic magistracies. A proconsul had to understand local laws and customs, manage complex financial arrangements for military pay and supply, negotiate with foreign rulers and tribal leaders, adjudicate disputes between Roman citizens and provincial inhabitants, and coordinate military operations across vast territories with unreliable communication systems. These responsibilities required not only executive ability, but also diplomatic skill, military expertise, legal knowledge, and cultural sensitivity that few Romans possessed when they first assumed provincial commands. The financial aspects of provincial administration created particularly complex challenges for republican institutions. Traditional Roman government had operated with relatively modest budgets, as most public services were provided through private arrangements or voluntary contributions by wealthy citizens. But provincial administration required substantial and predictable revenues for military pay, administrative expenses, public works, and various other purposes that could not be funded through traditional methods. The Romans developed systems of provincial taxation and tribute that generated enormous revenues. But these systems also created opportunities for corruption and abuse that were difficult to control through traditional republican oversight mechanisms. The management of these provincial revenues created new relationships between Roman officials and private contractors that had no precedent in traditional republican practice. Tax collection in the provinces was typically contracted to private companies publicani, who paid fixed sums to the Roman treasury and then attempted to collect larger amounts from provincial taxpayers to generate profits for themselves. This system provided predictable revenues for the state while transferring the risks and difficulties of collection to private entrepreneurs. But it also created incentives for exploitation and abuse that reflected poorly on Roman government and generated resentment among provincial populations. The military aspects of provincial command placed additional strains on republican institutions. Traditional Roman military service was based on citizen soldiers who served for limited periods and then returned to civilian life. But the maintenance of provincial frontiers required permanent military establishments with professional soldiers who made careers in military service. The recruitment, training, equipment, and command of these professional armies required resources and expertise that went far beyond traditional Roman military practice, and the loyalty of professional soldiers to their commanders rather than to the state created potential threats to republican institutions that had not existed when armies consisted of citizen militia. The Senate's role in managing provincial affairs required significant adaptations to traditional procedures and practices. Senators had to develop expertise in foreign affairs, military strategy, provincial administration, and imperial finance. That went far beyond the knowledge required for domestic governance. Senate meetings increasingly focused on provincial matters rather than local issues, and senatorial debates dealt with problems that required specialized knowledge and experience that not all senators possessed. It's the collective wisdom that had been the Senate's greatest strength in domestic affairs was less effective in addressing the complex and technical issues raised by imperial administration. The popular assemblies faced even greater challenges in adapting to imperial responsibilities. The territorial organization of the comitia tributa and the military organization of the comitia centuriata had been designed for a citizen body that was geographically concentrated and personally acquainted with the issues under consideration. But imperial governance involved decisions about distant territories, foreign peoples, and complex military and diplomatic situations that most citizens could not understand from personal experience. The assemblies could still vote to approve or reject proposals made by magistrates, but the informed citizen participation that had been essential to republican government became increasingly difficult to maintain. The expansion of Roman citizenship to include inhabitants of Italian cities and eventually provincial communities created additional challenges for traditional republican institutions. The popular assemblies had been designed for a relatively small number of citizens who could physically gather in Rome to participate in voting, but the expansion of citizenship created a citizen body too large to participate effectively in traditional procedures. Most citizens lived too far from Rome to attend assembly meetings regularly, and those who could attend were not necessarily representative of the broader citizen body or knowledgeable about the issues under consideration. The judicial responsibilities of magistrates became increasingly complex as Roman law had to be applied to diverse populations with different legal traditions and cultural practices. A praetor exercising jurisdiction in a province with Greek cities, Gallic tribes, and various other communities had to understand multiple legal systems, and develop procedures for resolving disputes between parties with different legal backgrounds. The development of the jus gentium law applicable to foreigners and mixed cases represented an attempt to address these challenges. But it also represented a departure from traditional Roman legal practice that had been based on citizenship and local custom, as Gaius Imperialis included another day of provincial administration reviewing reports from subordinate commanders, adjudicating disputes between Roman merchants and local communities, planning military operations for the following campaign season, and composing correspondence to the Senate about policy issues. The gap between Republican theory and imperial practice had become increasingly apparent. The institutions designed for city-state governance were being stretched to accommodate imperial responsibilities that required different approaches, different skills, and different relationships between officials and citizens. The success of Roman arms had created an empire. But the republican institutions that had made that success possible were being transformed by the very achievements they had enabled. How long could traditional procedures and practices accommodate the pressures of imperial governance? What would happen when the tensions between republican principles and imperial necessities became impossible to resolve through gradual adaptation and institutional flexibility? By the 1st century BCE, the cumulative effect of 2 centuries of imperial expansion and institutional adaptation had created a Roman state that bore little resemblance to the city-state republic of earlier centuries, though the transformation had occurred so gradually and through such seemingly minor adjustments that few Romans recognized how fundamentally their government had changed. The magistrates still bore traditional titles and observed ancient ceremonies. The Senate still met according to established procedures and debated policy questions, and the popular assemblies still convened to elect officials and vote on legislation. Yet beneath this facade of institutional continuity, the actual distribution of power and the practical operation of government had been revolutionized in ways that made the emergence of personal rule not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. The transformation began with changes so subtle and apparently temporary that they attracted little attention from contemporaries, who were focused on immediate practical problems rather than long-term constitutional implications. The extension of imperium through promagistracies, originally intended as exceptional measures to complete specific military operations, had become routine practices that gave individual commanders unprecedented power and independence. The assignment of multiple provinces to single officials, initially justified by administrative efficiency and military necessity, had created proconsular commands that rivaled the authority of kings. The recruitment of professional armies loyal to their commanders rather than to the state had established the foundation for personal military power that could challenge republican institutions directly. Consider the career of a successful Roman politician in the late Republic, perhaps during the era of Marius and Sulla, when the tensions between traditional republican procedures and imperial necessities were becoming impossible to ignore. This politician, whom we might call Lucius Ambassadus, followed the traditional cursus honorum, holding the quaestorship, praetorship, and consulship in proper sequence and at appropriate intervals. But the actual substance of these offices had been transformed by the imperial context in which he exercised them, creating opportunities for personal advancement and political influence that would have been unimaginable to magistrates of earlier centuries. As quaestor, Lucius Ambassadus was assigned to serve as financial assistant to a proconsul governing one of the wealthy eastern provinces, a position that gave him intimate knowledge of provincial administration and access to resources that dwarfed anything available through domestic Roman politics. The traditional quaestorship had been a junior magistracy with limited responsibilities for public finance and record-keeping. But service in a provincial command provided opportunities to develop networks of personal relationships with local elites, contractors, and military officers that could prove valuable throughout a political career. The young quaestor who served effectively in provincial administration could return to Rome with wealth, experience, and connections that gave him significant advantages in subsequent electoral competitions. The praetorship provided Lucius Ambitius with his first experience of independent command. But the nature of praetorian authority had been fundamentally altered by imperial expansion. Where earlier praetors had exercised judicial functions within the city of Rome or commanded relatively small military forces in nearby territories, the praetors of the late Republic were often assigned to govern entire provinces with populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions. A praetor governing Sicily or Sardinia exercised more real power than most kings of the ancient world, making decisions about taxation, military policy, judicial procedures, and administrative organization that affected more people than lived. In the entire Roman territory of earlier centuries, the consulship, the pinnacle of the traditional republican career, had become something entirely different from what the founders of the Republic had envisioned. Instead of serving as one of two collegial executives, responsible for domestic administration and occasionally leading citizen armies in local conflicts, consuls of the late Republic were routinely assigned to major military commands that lasted 4 years and involved the conquest or administration of vast territories. A consul assigned to Gaul, as Julius Caesar would be, commanded armies larger than those that had conquered most of the Mediterranean world and governed territories more extensive than many later European kingdoms. The daily routine of such a consul bore little resemblance to the ceremonial and administrative activities that had characterized the office in earlier periods. Instead of presiding over Senate meetings and conducting judicial hearings in the Roman Forum, Lucius Ambitius might spend his consular year leading military campaigns in Germania, negotiating treaties with Gallic chieftains, establishing Roman colonies in conquered territories, and organizing the administration of newly acquired provinces. These activities required skills and generated experiences that were fundamentally different from traditional republican governance and created personal relationships with soldiers and provincial subjects that had no precedent in earlier Roman political practice. The extension of consular imperium through proconsular commands allowed Lucius Ambitius to continue exercising these extraordinary powers for additional years after his formal term had expired. As proconsul, he was effectively an independent ruler, constrained primarily by the practical limitations of distance and communication rather than by institutional oversight or collegial restraint. He could recruit additional legions, wage wars against neighboring peoples, establish new administrative policies, and accumulate wealth and prestige on a scale that enabled him to compete with the traditional Roman elite on equal or superior terms. The financial resources available to successful provincial commanders had grown to levels that transformed the nature of Roman political competition. The wealth that could be extracted from rich provinces like Asia or Syria through legitimate taxation, military plunder, and various administrative arrangements dwarfed the resources available through traditional Roman sources of income. A proconsul who governed a wealthy province for several years could return to Rome with sufficient wealth to fund elaborate public entertainments, sponsor massive building projects, and provide generous rewards to political supporters, creating a base of popular and elite support that could sustain a political career indefinitely. The military resources controlled by provincial commanders represented an even more significant departure from republican traditions. The citizen armies of the early Republic had served for limited periods under commanders who had no personal claim on their loyalty beyond their official authority and temporary leadership. But the professional legions of the late Republic served for decades under commanders who recruited them, equipped them, led them in battle, and provided for their retirement through land grants and monetary rewards. These soldiers developed personal loyalty to their commanders that often superseded their allegiance to the Roman state, creating the foundation for military, challenges to Republican authority. The Senate's ability to control these powerful provincial commanders had been progressively weakened by the same developments that had increased the commander's independence and resources. Senators who had never held major provincial commands lacked the experience and credibility to challenge the policies and decisions of successful proconsuls. The Senate's traditional tools of oversight, withholding supplies, refusing to extend commands, conducting investigations, were less effective against commanders who controlled their own resources and commanded the personal loyalty of professional armies. The collective wisdom that had been the Senate's greatest strength was less relevant in addressing challenges that required specialized knowledge of military strategy, provincial administration, and imperial finance. The popular assemblies faced even greater difficulties in maintaining their traditional role in Republican government. The citizens who attended assembly meetings in Rome were increasingly unrepresentative of the broader citizen body, which now included millions of people scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. The issues under consideration: provincial assignments, military commands. Foreign treaties were often beyond the knowledge and experience of ordinary citizens who had little direct contact with imperial affairs. The assemblies could still vote to approve or reject proposals, but their decisions were increasingly influenced by the wealth and organization of competing political factions rather than by informed citizen deliberation. The transformation of Roman political culture that accompanied these institutional changes was perhaps even more significant than the formal modifications to governmental procedures. The values and expectations that had sustained Republican government: collective decision-making, rotation in office, accountability to peers, service to the state, were gradually replaced by different values more appropriate to imperial administration: personal achievement, professional competence, loyalty to commanders, and pursuit of individual advancement. These new values were not necessarily inferior to Republican ideals, but they were fundamentally incompatible with the institutional arrangements that had made Republican government possible. The careers of individuals like Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus represented the logical culmination of these developments. These men had achieved positions of power and influence that made them more than equal to the traditional Republican institutions that were supposed to control and direct them. They commanded personal armies, controlled vast financial resources, enjoyed widespread popular support, and possessed the administrative experience necessary to govern an empire. Their conflict with each other and with the remnants of Republican authority was not the result of personal ambition alone, but the inevitable consequence of institutional arrangements that had created centers of personal power incompatible with collective governance. As Lucius Ambitius returned to Rome after years of provincial command, having accumulated the wealth, military experience, and political connections that made him one of the most powerful men in the Roman world, the republic that had created opportunities for his advancement no longer possessed the institutional capacity to control or direct his activities. The gradual transformation of Republican institutions had created the conditions for personal rule, and it remained only for individuals with sufficient ambition and capability to seize the opportunities that institutional change had created. The establishment of the Principate under Augustus was thus not a revolutionary break with Republican tradition, but rather the formal recognition of a transformation that had already occurred through decades of gradual institutional adaptation. The empire that emerged from the Republic was not imposed by force alone, but grew naturally from the constitutional and practical adjustments that Romans had made to address the challenges of governing a Mediterranean empire with institutions designed for city-state governance. Yet, even as Augustus created new institutions that would govern the Roman world for centuries to come, he preserved the forms and ceremonies of Republican government, maintaining the fiction that he was merely the first citizen of a restored republic rather than the founder of a new imperial system. This careful balance between innovation and tradition between imperial necessity and republican sentiment, would prove to be one of the most successful political arrangements in human history, enabling the Roman Empire to provide stable and effective government for territories and populations far beyond the capacity of any previous political system. How did this transformation occur so gradually and quietly that few contemporaries recognized its significance? What does the Roman experience suggest about the relationship between institutional forms and political reality? And what lessons might be drawn from the Republic's evolution about the challenges of adapting governmental systems to changing circumstances and expanding responsibilities? As you drift toward sleep, consider how these four stories of ancient Rome: the weight of daily routine, the machinery of imperial administration, the slow decline of bureaucratic complexity, and the gradual transformation of republican institutions, reveal the profound truth that civilizations are built not through dramatic moments alone, but through the accumulation of countless ordinary days, routine procedures, and gradual adaptations that shape the world so slowly that those living through the changes barely notice their significance. The Romans, who woke each morning to their predictable routines of work and leisure, who served faithfully in the expanding bureaucracy that governed an empire, who struggled to maintain administrative systems under increasing strain, and who adapted republican institutions to meet imperial necessities, were creating and destroying one of history's greatest civilizations through their daily choices and routine activities. Their story reminds us that the most important historical changes often occur not through revolution or conquest, but through the quiet evolution of customs, institutions, and expectations that gradually transform the world in ways that become apparent only in retrospect. The boring details of Roman history, the 6-hour workday, the elaborate bathing rituals, the complex tax procedures, the routine Senate meetings were not merely background to more important events, but were themselves the substance of historical change. In understanding how Romans lived their daily lives, managed their government, and adapted their institutions, we come to understand how human societies actually function and change over time. One unremarkable but essential day at a time. Sleep. Well, knowing that you too are part of this great human story of gradual change and institutional adaptation, contributing through your own daily routines and ordinary choices to the ongoing transformation of civilization that connects you to Romans who lived 2,000 years ago and to people who will live 2,000 years in the future.